Nous accueillons à présent Renzo Leonardi et Pullen pour nous parler de la tête de Fernande de 1909, un sujet que vous investiguez l'un et l'autre depuis de nombreuses années. Alors Renzo Leonardi, vous êtes professeur émérite de sciences physiques de l'Université de Trento en Italie, spécialiste de la physique nucléaire appliquée au domaine de la médecine. Et Pullen, vous êtes l'ancien restaurateur en chef du département sculpture de la Tate à Londres. Et donc nous vous écoutons nous parler des têtes de Fernande de 1909. Merci.
Thank you. And good morning, everybody. In an essay in the catalogue of the 2003 Washington exhibition, where these plasters were first shown together, Valerie Fletcher, chief curator at the Herschel Museum, qualified her insights into the sculptures with, and I quote, "Bear in mind that no scientific analyses have been done on any of the works discussed. Perhaps my efforts will engender such examinations in the near future." After seeing the Washington exhibition, Renzo, my co-author, contacted me at the Tate with a technical question about bronze casting. Our conversation developed into a joint quest, a personal project to take up Valerie's challenge to better understand the plasters and their relationship to the bronzes. In this brief talk, we can only outline what we are doing, as of course much remains to be done. We don't know exactly how many bronze heads were cast from Picasso's original model. We think 20, maybe more. Diana, Picasso, has been very helpful in locating and dating some of these casts, of which we've been so far able to examine more than half. None of the bronze casts are numbered, and precise records of their manufacture don't appear to have survived. We don't yet know exactly which foundries were used, nor which bronzes were cast in which foundries. The history of the plasters and their relationship to each other and the numerous bronzes has been uncertain and confusing. We've tried to clarify their histories through our close examination of the sculptures themselves. But first, some background. At the end of the summer of 1909, Picasso returned from Spain to Paris, and there at the beginning of autumn, he modelled what today is known as the head of a woman, Fernande, or simply Fernande. According to his own inscription on the back of a photograph, Picasso modelled the sculpture in the studio of his friend, the sculptor Manolo. The clay model was probably destroyed during the process of making the first plaster. Picasso was almost certainly present when the plaster sculpture was released from the mould. As he told Cooper and Richardson, he made alterations to the front of the neck with a knife. And you can see this area here and in the exhibition. We believe this alteration, made by cutting into the plaster, can only be done as smoothly as it appears when the fresh plaster has not had time to fully harden. At this stage, it has the consistency of hard cheese. Later, it becomes like a brittle rock. Why Picasso chose to carve this one small area and leave the rest softly modelled remains a puzzle and open to a lot of speculation. Of the two plasters, the Latina family plaster was purchased in 1968 from Ernst Beiler, who had bought it the same year from Jacques Ullmann. Since 1994, it has been on loan to the Tate. The Nasher plaster in Dallas comes from Marina Picasso's portion of the Picasso estate, sold through Jan Crougier's gallery in 1987. This plaster includes a round base, a socle. The existence of two plasters was hardly known before 1986, and since then, both plasters have been referred back to the estate of Ambroise Vollard and the collector Jacques Ullmann. Both have been described as original, although the Nasher with its socle was identified in the 2003 exhibition catalogue as a working plaster, contemporary in date with the Latina. It was not clear how or when the Nasher plaster became part of Picasso's estate. But here is what we think happened. Heinz Berggruen learned that Jacques Ullmann, a collector with connections to the Vollard heirs, had several plaster casts of early Picasso sculptures, including Fernande. Berggruen asked Picasso in 1960 for permission to reproduce the additional bronzes from the plasters using Claude Valsoine's foundry. According to these agreements, Berggruen would cast 9 bronzes, 3 for Picasso and 6 for himself. In an interview with us in 2004, Herr Berggruen not only confirmed that this was the agreement, but also that he personally gave Picasso the 3 bronzes. And here they are in the studio in September 1960. Berggruen also claimed that he never handled the plaster, as that was given by Ullmann directly to the Valsoine foundry, and that he had never seen a plaster with a socle. Berggruen said that until we spoke of it in our interview, he didn't know that there was a plaster with a socle. Valerie Fletcher, in her 2003 article, thought that both plasters at some stage were used to make many molds for bronze casting, based on the many fine cut lines that can be seen in both plasters. These she correctly identified as incisions made when a plaster is prepared for a sand mold or released from multiple gelatin molds. Fletcher examined the Nasher plaster separately from the Latina, just at the time that her essay was going to press, so she didn't have time to correct anything. She didn't realize that these incised cuts are in exactly the same location on both plasters, because the Nasher plaster is a late copy of the Latina and not vice versa. Apart from the socle, which is cast as one with the head, it is an astonishingly exact copy. As evidence, we see that all the details, including hundreds of tiny air bubbles present in the surface of the Latina plaster, are faithfully reproduced in the Nasher plaster. However, the Nasher plaster has some more air bubbles which are not present in the Latina. And if you look closely, particularly at the letter O, it has a larger bubble, and both S's in the Nasher plaster. And remember those because we'll refer to them later. Also, the Latina plaster, which over decades has repeatedly served to provide molds for bronzes, inevitably suffered accidental damages at the various foundries used by Vollard. These damages are replicated exactly in the Nasher plaster. In one of these accidents, a small chip of plaster of a couple of centimeters was lost from the backside of the base of the head. This loss can be clearly seen in the Nasher plaster where it's cast in the plaster itself. And this type of detail is important in discussing the bronzes because it may help to identify bronzes cast before a damage from those cast after a damage. This slide shows how the Nasher plaster might have been cast with its socle. I illustrate it here with a flexible mold made using a urethane or silicon elastomer. But as it's unlikely that modern flexible molds were used by Valsoine in 1960, we've learnt that today, it could just as easily have been a gelatin mold, and probably was. So the Nasher plaster was cast from the Latina. But we also contend that the molds used to cast the 9 Berggruen Valsoine bronzes was taken from the Nasher plaster, not from the Latina, as previously thought. These Berggruen Valsoine bronzes are by far the most faithful copies of the plasters in terms of sharpness of detail and minimal shrinkage, which confirms just what we heard a little earlier this morning. Better than the Vollards, the bronzes exactly reproduce the air bubbles found only in the Nasher plaster. And again, if you look at the O in the bronze and the O in the Nasher plaster, but not the O in the Latina, that's just one example of where the Nasher is the source for the Berggruen bronzes. The penultimate stage in casting of a bronze prior to patination is to chase the surface, to remove any casting defects. To do this, the craftsperson, the chaser or ciseleur, needs a reference model on the bench to ensure an exact match to the sculptor's original model. If that original model is not available, perhaps because it's become too valuable or is too fragile to be left around in the workshop, then a copy, a secondary plaster, or working plaster is made, as described by Monsieur Dubois. Having a socle means that the working plaster can be handled and turned at the bench without risk of damage to any fine surface detail. So we claim, with some confidence, that the Nasher plaster with its round socle was cast from a mould taken off the Latina plaster, and that a mould subsequently taken from the Nasher plaster was used to cast the 9 bronzes of the Berggruen edition. This happened, as far as we can tell, no earlier than 1960. And I wrote, perhaps it remained at Valsuani's foundry, inventoried until inventoried as part of the Picasso estate. And we learnt yesterday, thanks to Christine Pio, that that was indeed the case. The bronze Fernande cast by Vollard between 1911 and his death in 1939, and possibly after his death, all used the Latina plaster as a model. To date, there are at least 20 unnumbered bronzes and the 9 commissioned by Berggruen. Diana's researchers have confirmed that Vollard only cast Picasso bronzes 1 or 2 at a time. He also seems to have used several foundries and employed both sandcast and lost wax processes. None of Vollard's casts of Fernande carry a foundry stamp that we've been able to find. Their early provenance is often uncertain, but we thought we might be able to correlate the accumulated damages found in the Latina plaster from those found, or not found, in a bronze, and thereby start to put the castings in some sort of date order. Some of these traces, the damages and repairs, show more clearly under ultraviolet light on the plaster. So 2 identical views of the Latina plaster, and take note of the damage in the top left, which you can see in the which shows up much more clearly under ultraviolet light. Knowing that there were a large number of unmarked bronzes and possibly some unauthorized casts and surmelage, we also wanted to know how much variation to expect within a large family of legitimate bronzes, that is, bronzes cast from the same parent plaster model. We sought out better authenticated casts of Fernande in various institutions and are immensely grateful for the cooperation of many collectors, curators, and conservators who gave us access to their collections. Until 2011, our examinations were limited to visual comparisons and tracings of the bases of the bronzes and the plasters. To progress the study and improve the quality and quantity of our comparisons, we adopted laser scanning. Not sure how clear that slide is. A 3D laser scan provides an exceptional technique to study and compare the different casts of the head of Fernande and the original Latina plaster. We could create virtual images of the plaster and a bronze and then compare each with the other as measured cross-sections as shown on the screen. For essential technical assistance, we depended on the 3D optical metrology laboratory in Trento, part of the research institution Fondazione Bruno Kessler. And this is the team scanning at the Berggruen. Yeah, Erica and Fabio. Thank you, Renzo. It's important to stress that laser scans are of no practical use to make illegitimate copies. They don't have enough detail to deceive anyone. Up till now, we've been able to compare the Latina plaster with bronzes of the Metropolitan Museum and MoMA in New York, with the National Gallery and Herschel Museum in Washington, and with several others. Laser scanning enabled us to identify many subtle differences between the Latina plaster and the bronzes and confirm our observations. well-documented early bronzes, including Prague's, which is shown here with the Latina plaster, or the Musée Picasso's or the Art Institute of Chicago's bronzes, which are both in the current display. They are intact and without traces of damages, such as the fragment missing from the base of the Latina plaster already mentioned. And I've circled on the screen that area, that grey area in the right slide, where the front is damaged. And that means it's right off the scale of comparisons. Otherwise, the scale is really in sub-millimeters. The results of our analysis will be discussed in detail in a dedicated paper elsewhere. But let's just mention that the volumetric shrinkage in the bronze casting process spans from 4 to 11%, which corresponds to a linear shrinkage, such as the height, in the range of 1.5 to 4%. This kind of shrinkage is in line with that reported in the literature, but is perhaps wider than expected, especially for the earlier bronzes, which have tended to be sandcasts. In conclusion, we've described the results of looking closely at the various forms of a sculpture, from clay to plaster to bronze. We've shown that the relationship is rather more than that of identical copies, and that the details and differences between each of Picasso's Fernande sculptures are crucial to their historical context. Valerie Fletcher inspired our own project by suggesting that much remains to be revealed by scientific analyses. But if there's one lesson we take from our investigations, it's that while technology will undoubtedly assist future modern research, much remains to be discovered simply by looking at sculptures very, very closely. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Derek, pour cette présentation très fouillée, là aussi, donc cette investigation donc, dans les Fernandes de 1909 qui nous permettent de resituer plus justement ces deux plâtres de fonderie que nous présentons actuellement dans l'exposition. Donc le plâtre qui est en dépôt actuellement à la Tate moderne de Londres et que l'on peut resituer à l'origine des éditions Vollard, et le plâtre de fonderie du Nasher Sculpture Center qui se situe à l'origine des éditions dites Berggruen. Je pense qu'il va y avoir des réactions dans la salle, donc je laisse tout de suite la parole à l'audience. Peut-être à Christine Pio, notamment, puisque vous avez... on vous fait parler aujourd'hui, Christine, mais c'est vous qui avez retrouvé ce plâtre de fonderie monté encore sur son socle à clé.
Oui, c'est vrai que c'est un épisode parmi d'autres de la succession. J'étais allée chez Valzuani et par chance... j'y suis allée avec Madame Lashkar, qui était l'huissier de justice, qui m'accompagnait, je ne sais pas trop pourquoi, ni comment. Mais Monsieur Valzuani, est-ce que c'était Claude à cette époque? Oui, Claude Valzuani, je crois, entre 75 et 81, donc qui était très ouvert et très disposé à nous aider, à essayer de rechercher les archives, etc., nous dit à un certain moment: ah, mais au fait, là, j'ai un plâtre que je devais rendre à Picasso. Sous-entendu, je ne sais pas quoi en faire. Et alors, on a sauté sur l'occasion parce que Madame Lashkar était en voiture. Et on a dit: écoutez, si vous êtes d'accord, nous l'emmenons. Et donc, avec Madame Lashkar, on s'est dit: on va tout de suite au garde-meuble où étaient à Belleville les bronzes et les plâtres pour mettre ce plâtre en sécurité. Donc, Madame Lashkar conduisait la voiture, non sans émotion. Moi, j'étais derrière avec le plâtre sur les genoux, que j'entourais de mes bras délicatement. Et voilà, c'est un bel épisode.
Merci Christine.